Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in our series of live CLAG webinars. I'd like to welcome you as well as our three panelists and our moderator. As many of you know, my name is Jim Biles and I have been organizing these live CLAG sessions on behalf of the Conference of Latin American Geography over the past several weeks. Today, our topic is reflections on sovereignty, retrieving emancipatory politics in the Caribbean and Central America. We have three panelists with us today, and our moderator is Lara Rivas from the CUNY Graduate Center. So I'd like to thank Lara for organizing and moderating today's session. And I want to welcome and thank our three panelists for being here today and for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. So with that, I will turn the floor, the microphone, and the responsibility over to Lara.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our panel, Reflections on Sovereignty, Retrieving Emancipatory Politics in the Caribbean and Central America. The intervention of our panelists will begin shortly, where they will be critiquing liberal sovereignty and pointing us towards alternative practices and conceptualizations. Each intervention will last about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we've allocated some time for questions at the end. So please be sure to pose whatever questions or discussion points come up in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker of the day, Dr. Sarah Riva. Dr. Riva is a feminist and a border abolitionist. She obtained her PhD from the Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department at The Ohio State University. Sara currently holds a Marie Curie Research Fellowship at the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in Madrid, Spain, and at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. She has published about her work in the Citizenship Studies Journal, the Journal of Refugee Studies, Comparative Migration Studies, as well as Deconversation, and blogs such as Border Criminologies and Discover Society. Sara is interested in the intersection of neoliberalism, borders, humanitarianism, neocolonialism, and migration. Her presentation is titled Neoliberalism as a Necessary Condition for Transnational Sovereignty, and it will develop the concept of transnational sovereignty in relation to state border violence. Thank you for being here, Sara.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for everyone for organizing this, and to my fellow panelists. Let me put the clock on. I don't want to go. This is a tradition in my country. Everybody has a time limit, nobody respects it, and then the last person has like 5 minutes, you know, so I don't want to be that person. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you for the presentation. Okay, so my talk is called Neoliberalism as a Necessary Condition for Transnational Sovereignty. And this talk, so this is a very structuralist approach that I take on borders and sovereignty, and also neoliberalism, which obviously has been critiqued by many authors. For instance, I was thinking about Aiwa Ong and other authors that have critiqued such a, it's very like Wallersteinian kind of point of view, but I still think it's very useful, at least for me and for my work, to understand how things work, because I'm focusing this on refugees and people who seek asylum, right? So the first thing I need to define what are borders. So traditionally, borders used to be like what some authors have called like a line in the sand that separate one territory from the next. But now this conception of borders has completely changed, and we have to think about borders as like assemblages with different moving parts. And what I'm going to call bordering practices, right? So where are borders? we used to think, that the border was where the line was, right? Separating one country from the next, but that's not actually the case anymore. Borders have been externalized. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in regards to sovereignty. And the other questions I think is really important to ask is, when are borders? Because borders are not they're not fixed in terms of space. They're historically contingent, and it's the same with time. We need to think about this in terms of time. So a person who has been locked up in Nauru, which is a nation state in the Pacific, for example, where they lock people up who seek asylum in Australia. So in a privatized prison, by the way, I'm going to talk about that too, who's been there indefinitely detained for the last 5 years. And then a person who's living in the US undocumented, they are both experiencing the border every day. Obviously, they're completely different experiences, but they are in their daily lives, the border is there. And I think that's important to notice. Connected to borders, sovereignty, right? Which is one of the topics that we're going to be addressing tonight for me, today for you. So classic notions of sovereignty used to consider borders something that demarcates the outside from the inside, right? And they were territorially and spatially and territorially fixed. And they established the ultimate authority of the state within this territory. So it was like a place where nations would exercise, so nation states would, rather than nations, would exercise sovereignty. But that's not the case anymore. Because what we have now is, well, some authors have conceptualized is transnational sovereignty, which I'm going to define in a minute, right? So Australia, the EU, and the US, which I'm just talking about the global north, which of course it's an ideological contract, but I'm just focusing on these regions. And again, this is where I'm being very structuralist, because this also happens within places in the global south, within places in the global north, within, in many, many places. But they enact measures beyond the physical limits of the territory, so transnationally, through bordering mechanisms. So through the exercise of sovereignty, these regions enact bordering mechanisms to protect themselves against people who seek asylum and migrants. And they reproduce, I wrote a colonial, but maybe neo-colonial shape of the world. It doesn't matter really. So what are these measures that I'm talking about, bordering mechanisms? So there's like two parts to these: border externalization measures or practices, and discourses. And it's super important to remember that these two go hand in hand, like these courses enable these practices, right? So some of these practices would be, for instance, outsourcing visa processing. So I don't know, if you need a visa to go to many places in the world, you just do it through a private company, right? Which is very neoliberal. Actually, sorry, I completely forgot to define neoliberalism. So neoliberalism in economic, it affects the economy, subjectivities, everything. It's an ideology, it's everywhere, right? But in terms of economy, it means, I use it in a, like Harvey, like many authors, like privatizing. So to public problems, private solutions, basically, right? So privatizing education, privatizing healthcare, or I don't know, you need to do something in your neighborhood, take care of people who live on the streets. Instead of the state doing it, you hire someone because it's cheaper, someone like an organization or a corporation, you hire them because it's cheaper and you're going to be saving money. Deregulation, so taking your factories away from where you are, sending them to a cheaper country. Privatizing everything. And then it also affects subjectivities, which is also a way of individualizing the problem. So this rhetoric about being self-responsible, self-sufficient, not depending on anyone, especially on the state. Of course, heteronormativity is one of the biggest things, right? So you need to be straight, you need to be white, you need to be upper middle class, you need to get married, you need to have children, and all those things. But especially this responsibility discourse. So outsourcing visa processing, this is one of the things that is happening, right? Short-term stateless zones associated with transit. to isolate migrants before they disembark from planes. And maybe you've seen this. You're going to disembark the plane, and on the finger, there's a police officer or someone from immigration. They're stopping people and putting people aside. And yeah, it's not even considered the country. So those places are stateless, right? So you didn't reach the country. That's very convenient. Interception practices at sea, cooperation and deportation procedures with other countries, surveillance of routes and carriers of migration, technical cooperation in border surveillance, safe third country agreements. All these are practices, right? Practices. Implementation and training of biometric security measures. This is like a whole, like the surveillance mechanisms of the state. That's like a people swap, offshore processing, immigrant detention, training programs in other countries, confinement. I was telling you, indefinite detention in some places like Australia. Advertising campaigns to discourage people, like focusing on the human trafficking or people smuggler idea, that if we let refugees come here, we're just helping human traffickers. Like this is the rhetoric in the Mediterranean and in Australia all the time. And I'm sure you've seen the news about captains of ships being detained, accused of human traffickers, of being human traffickers because they helped someone in the sea because they were drowning. And these courses, and this I think is really, really important because all these practices, although they all converge transnationally, they are rooted in racist, gender discourses that are local, right? So I don't know, if we think of, Muslims, they're considered terrorists or like rapists. If we think of Central American women who cross the US-Mexico border seeking asylum, we think of them like deviant mothers. These women, they have too many children, they come here to take advantage, or something that I always like. I always think it's really funny how the discourse goes like these people are taking advantage of the country, the education, everything, and then you have the same discourse, like the parallel discourse. These people are taking our jobs, blah, blah, and I'm always like, which is it? Are they taking your jobs or are they lazy and they don't want to work? Make up your mind. But somehow those two discourses work together. So these externalization measures rely on two things: agreements with third countries, with colonialist overtones, although it's complicated, and we could talk about this in the Q&A if you want, but there's like a power dynamics that's going on there, and the public-private partnership. So this is key, absolutely key for externalization measures, the partnership. So really quickly, when we look at Australia and we think about Australia and the border, all the countries that are in orange are places where Australia has been acting measures to protect its borders, right? So I don't know, the furthest point that I can see right now is Morocco and the Sahara. They are implementing programs there to protect their borders. Or Saudi Arabia, obviously China, and other places. For the EU, this is something similar. So the EU has programs in all these countries to protect their borders. So if you're Bolivian, for example, like looking at Latin America, you have programs there that are already stopping you from coming to Spain because that's where the language is easy. The same with the United States. In I don't know, Panama, I can see, and other places where they also have like detention centers, law enforcement cooperation. I'll talk about that now. So basically, there's like this transnational sovereign assemblage that is protecting all these countries from people from the global south coming to the global north. In the case of the United States, like there's all these military bases to prevent migration. So there was one in Ecuador that had been for many years until they had like this really leftist government and they were like, yeah, no, that's it. And then, so they had to leave. But then they have like detention centers, short-term, long-term, like Guantanamo, which is privately run now. I could talk about all these, like all Australia's immigration detention centers, they're all private. The one where I did my research in the US, in Texas, in the US-Mexico border, was private. So neoliberalism is really, really into all these things. And what I was telling you before, now the US teamed up with law enforcement from different countries to stop migration. So Mexico can deport people directly in the name of, just go back to your country. What are the consequences of this assemblage? So first of all, it transfers the burden of enforcement and containment to those countries in the global south, right? Because a lot of all these detention centers are actually in the global south. It reproduces the neocolonial order. It obviously limits mobility for certain subjects. It puts asylum seekers' lives at risk by confining them in the regions where they're actually experiencing danger. It makes refugees journeys more dangerous. And there's like loads of programs in the US that have made refugees or people who seek asylum or just migrants, it doesn't matter. Actually, I don't make any difference, because I think making a difference between a refugee and being an asylum seeker, the only difference is that in one of them you've been legally recognized. So if we reproduce this discourse, in the end, I think we are reinforcing the idea that someone is worth of protection, while the other person, we will see. It has to be, we need to study that. So, but anyway, it makes their journeys more dangerous. It creates a distance between the state and the refugee. That's directly neoliberalism. And I have millions of examples that we can think of. But imagine you're a Moroccan woman. You want a visa to go to France. I don't know, to see your daughter. Let's not make it like a refugee story. You go to the visa company. They reject you. You can't get a visa, madam. And you're like, who can I talk to? I mean, if you go to France, to the state of France to talk to them, which obviously they would never talk to you, they're going to say, it's the company. And then if you go to the company, they're going to say, it's the program, it's the state, we didn't do anything. So this is very convenient for the states, right? The few who make it are commodified. And I was thinking about the private, the detention centers, the private detention centers, where they make profit out of those people who are traveling. And it depoliticizes migration management. And this is also like a consequence of neoliberalism. In the end, we think these people are coming, these people, imagine, they're having a really hard time, they're coming. Hold on, let's think, what is our responsibility as the US, as Europe, as former colonies in the situation that it's happening today? And I always like to cite Jen L'Espiritu. She always says, I don't know if she's a woman. They always say, sorry, I was convinced, and then I'm like, I don't know. They always say, refugee and refuge are co-constitutive. And all these things just individualize the problem and makes us think that it's just one person. Let me check the time. Anyway, I'm almost done. So how can we challenge state violence? The first thing that comes to mind is to cancel agreements with the private sector, right? So just cancel everyone who's profiting out of other people's bodies and out of putting limits to people's mobility. And the migration management business is huge. There's a really good book by Ruben Anderson. It's called, I don't remember what it's called, something incorporation. Anyway, it's really good. He talks about this, sorry. I don't know why I mentioned him. I don't remember the name of the book, but it's really, really good. So that would be like a really important step, but I think it's more, I wouldn't say conservative, but I think it's moderate. What I would call for is for border abolition, definitely. And it's just a matter of social justice, nothing else. If some people can travel freely and other people cannot travel freely, I mean, we're not all playing the same game, so just let's, get rid of the game. And I'm going to do a shameless plug here. Laura, I'm sorry, but I need to do this. A few of us organized a conference this year in June. It's online. Check the website. It's Border Abolition 2021. And I would encourage everyone to submit, or at least to attend. It's 2 days with people that think that borders should be abolished. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much. And Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Riva. Our next speaker is Dr. Deborah Thomas. Dr. Thomas is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a research associate with the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Her recent book, Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing, Repair, was awarded the Senior Book Prize from the American Ethnological Society in 2020 and was also the runner-up for the Gregory Bateson Prize in the same year. She's also the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. She was also co-editor of the volume Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness. Her articles have appeared in a diverse range of academic journals. Thomas has also co-directed and co-produced 2 documentary films, Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, and 4 Days in May, Kingston 2010. She currently sits on the editorial board of Social and Economic Studies and Anthropological Theory and has served on the executive boards of the Association the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, the Caribbean Studies Association, and the Society for Cultural Anthropology. Prior to Thomas's life as an academic, she was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bush Women. Her talk today is titled Sovereignty Unhinged, and it will focus on the importance of thinking through sovereignty through frames other than those that have been normative. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you for bringing us all together for this webinar. It's a really interesting presentation, Sara, and of course I have like a million questions. But I will offer my tidbits. And at some point I will share my screen and allow you to see something other than my face. But today what I really wanted to do was talk a little bit about the utility of a concept of sovereignty that exists outside of normative frames. And so there will be, I think, some overlap with what Sara just presented to us. But I moved to go through this exercise because across the region, the Caribbean and Latin America, we are constantly confronted with evidence of the inability of these normative frames of sovereignty to really provide what citizens want and need. And today, the strength of many Caribbean states is evident only in their drive to securitize borders on one level, but also internally against members of their own populations. And they are not strong in the provision of social services and goods that allow people to feel safe, to thrive, and to determine their futures. So it seems to me necessary to think anew about what sovereignty could be in a different dispensation. So if one were to read a classical political text on sovereignty, one would expect to see references to Hobbes, to the Treaty of Westphalia, to Wilsonian notions of democracy, maybe to figures like Weber and Schmidt, and maybe even to anti-colonial struggles for independence. And these kinds of texts tell the story of sovereignty through the lens of the executive, with sovereignty understood as the political achievement of the liberal democratic nation state, right? The result of struggles to create new, more egalitarian societies in which rights-bearing citizens contribute to the life of the state through things like taxes and through political participation in order to receive benefits in return, such as education, healthcare, insurance, security. And the concern in this story of sovereignty has to do with who seizes state power within a liberal Western iteration of nation-state politics. And this is why sovereignty has become something of a disavowed category within Black studies. But we know that sovereignty remains both conceptually and materially pertinent for Black people across many locations, for those in the so-called post-colonial world, of course, and also for those in majority Black spaces. So many of us are obsessed with sovereignty and with what sovereignty feels like. And we're always imagining something that looks like sovereignty. And if it feels out of reach, we're compelled to reach toward it anyway. Because of this, I feel that sovereignty, both as an analytic and as a condition, cannot be disavowed as either false consciousness or as ontological impossibility. So these, for me, these frames of sovereignty, and I'm thinking here of like Afro-pessimism, for example, or some strands of Marxism, these kinds of frames rely too heavily upon masculinist notions of revolution and humanness. And the questions then have to do with how can we imagine sovereignty in languages other than action, agency, and control? And what insights might affect as a lens give us in thinking through moments when something that feels like sovereignty occurs, or when something that feels like sovereignty seems absent, right? How is sovereignty lived and enacted in the realm of everyday practice? And how might this reflect an aspiration for a new arrangement of our normative understandings of the spheres of both the geopolitical and the interpersonal? Another question, what are the afterlives and the new lives of 20th century notions of states, activism, and agency? And how are citizenship, relationship, and responsibility being configured in unpredictable ways in the 21st century? So I'm someone who has spent a great deal of time thinking through some of these questions and developing assemblages of archives of violence in Jamaica in order to catalyze difficult conversations about the relationships among violence, politics, and personhood. And I'm going to share my screen here. So for me, the point of bearing witness to state violence and other forms of violence, and the point of creating different archives and affective relationships to violence, is to chart new terrain upon which sovereignty can be elaborated and radiated. Right? And I've been interested in the ephemeral, the performative, the affective, and in the non-linear and unexpected ways, something that feels like sovereignty circulates and is transmitted from one to another. And this sovereignty is not an event. There's not a moment when we'll be able to point to something and identify its achievement. Instead, it's something that's constantly in process, something that's constantly emergent through dialogue, and something that both frames and enacts forms of love and responsibility. And there I mean responsibility in Avery Gordon's terms, where she frames it as the ability to respond, right? Responsibility. And you probably know that anthropologists have more generally been compelled to explore the diffuse, uncertain, and complex ways that people experience sovereignty and the challenge of navigating both uncertainty and survival. And they've been stimulated by Michel Foucault's biopolitics, Giorgio Agamben's notion of bare life, and Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomic networks of force and possibility. And these are typically political anthropologists who have borrowed from political philosophy the conceptualization of sovereignty as domination, but who have reframed this in terms of process and practice, more as performance than product. In doing so, they have been attuned to the entire universe of other concurrent processes, the intensifications of agency, the regimes of care and engagement, the temporal and spatial derangements that are not recognized traditionally as forms of sovereignty, but that are in fact where most of us are living most of the time. And what I've been interested in, what I've been working on with my colleague Joe Masco and others, is in unhinging sovereignty, right? Unhinging it from master narratives, unhinging it from normative disciplinary frames, and unhinging it from pragmatic developmentalism and utility, which also means unhinging it from the state. And we've been asking questions about what happens when the autonomous rational subject is no longer the starting point for analysis or for policy or for transformation. And when we begin instead from the energies, excesses, and ambitions of being out of order, dislocated, even hysterical or mad. This unhinging of sovereignty rests on a somewhat different theoretical lineage, one in which international relations, political economy, and the management of populations feature less prominently than embodied and phenomenological approaches to being, and one in which violence has been central to its exercise and performance. And I would ground this lineage within colonial, historical, ideological, and onto-epistemological phenomena that produce whiteness, maleness, and Europeanness as the apex of humanity, the epitome not only of transparency and universality, but also of determination and causality. Right, this is the iteration of Western European empire, right? And this inhabits the expression of sovereignty and animates the conquest and disavowal of what Edouard Glissant has called relation, right? Not only within Europe, but throughout the post-colonial world, right? So this kind of sovereignty is both delusional and crazy making, right? It demands a singularity of life out of a vast multiplicity. It creates and then naturalizes hierarchies that only function through dehumanization and exclusion. It's a sovereignty that's obsessed with security because its conquest, its cannibalism, its disavowal of exteriority is never seamless or complete, right? It requires constant work to install a singular concept of the human and a world order based on property relations. And this work is always potentially undone by that which fails to recognize it and by that which refuses it in intentional, both intentional and unconscious ways. And here I'm thinking about refusal in two ways, right? First, in its articulation by Black feminist scholars for whom refusal is a practice rather than an event, a creative, nimble, ultimately unpredictable modality through which subjects are unconsciously and otherwise, quote, refusing the terms of negation and dispossession, that's Tina Count, in which their lives are rendered valueless. And second is the sense of refusal proffered by indigenous scholars and other anthropologists for whom refusal is somewhat more intentional, right? And for these scholars, refusal marks a position of optimism and hope on the part of anthropologist interlocutors, but it also marks a methodological limit for anthropologists themselves. So if this kind of coloniality is our baseline for sovereignty, then confronting our contemporary condition requires a formulation of sovereignty that resides outside of these normative parameters, and one that is not rooted in being or history, but instead is rooted in a kind of nonlinear temporality and a non-utility. And here I'm taking a cue from Georges Bataille, who felt that sovereignty should be grounded in immediacy rather than in future thinking, and in consumption rather than in production, right? In the desire for nothingness rather than for attachment. For Bataille, early 20th century anthropology of non-capitalist societies, excuse me, provided important keys to thinking about relations between subjects and sovereigns. And he was particularly compelled by ethnographic representations of the potlatch, as these appeared to him to counter the exigencies of mercantile and industrial capitalism, whereby labor was oriented to future accumulation. And this, for Bataille, was a form of both literal and figurative slavery. For him, through an unproductive sharing of wealth, and by unproductive he meant a wealth that's not accumulated for future gain, Both the sovereign and the subject experience the primacy of the present, the miraculous excess, and the festival of life. Death, in this view, or the release of the fear of death, is the ultimate sovereign experience, and the states of laughter, sadness, rapture, anger, ecstasy, intoxication, horror, disgust, fear, magic, and eroticism all represent affective encounters with a non-exceptional sovereignty. So to refuse conventionally iterated sovereignty for Bataille's sovereignty in the storm is to seek a life beyond utility and beyond the engulfment of recognition. And what he called the human quality, he felt should not be sought in the language of either democratic rights and responsibilities or socialist collectivity, but in the one who, quote, refuses the given. Right? This iteration of sovereignty abandons the world of projects, eschews the expectation embedded within the temporality of the future, or the notions of progress, or the politics of recognition. And in disrupting the disavowals and deferrals that undergird imperial being, it also creates the conditions for meaningful forms of life by nullifying these normative relations that uphold being as the ground of subjectivity and governance. And this is particularly resonant throughout the so-called post-colonial world, where, as Achille Mbembe has argued, we continue to deal with a form of governmentality in which sovereignty consists fundamentally in the exercise of a power outside the law. Right, so there's a long list, of course, of scholars who have critiqued the post in post-colonial and who have limbed the continuation of imperial relations of domination, even as these have shifted over time. And while this scholarship ordinarily laments the failure to remake formerly colonial relations from the ground up, Jarimar Bonilla has instead suggested that exploring enduring forms of non-sovereignty should provide grounds for new theoretical and political openings. And these are her words. The notion of a sovereign nation state and its attendant sovereign individual who speaks and acts autonomously, she writes, is thus giving way to the recognition of the non-sovereign nature of most social relationships, political, intimate, affective, all of which require brokered and negotiated forms of interdependency and a relinquishing of autonomy. So if the practice of sovereignty must lay in non-utility, then its aim cannot be the seizure of state power, but instead its refusal and abolition, through which Savannah Shange has called a messy breakup with the state, right? A rending, not a reparation. Okay. And in other words, agency and sovereignty are not the same thing. And this opens up productive conceptual spaces for ethnographic inquiry. Paying attention to affective intensities, like the spaces in which non-utility thrives and refusals of the terms of recognition and moments of flagrancy is one way at getting at the unhinging that I'm glossing here, a way of thinking beside as well as with presumptions of possessive individualism and a way of siding with Nietzsche's madman. And thinking sovereignty in relation to affect rather than in the ways that we've been given, ways that have made possible certain imaginations but foreclosed others, offers us, I think, a conceptual space for analyzing historical formations as dynamic and as simultaneously constrained by the institutions, economic realities, and political conceits of different eras. And so what we must aspire to, I think, is a form of non-project oriented sovereignty that really creates the spaces of care and recognition that people need to thrive and to feel safe and to realize their ambitions in the world. And I'm happy to, during the Q&A, talk about the links between the images that you saw and the kinds of things I'm thinking through, but I can, wait for that for another time.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Once again, I'd like to remind the audience that they're welcome to post questions as they listen to these presentations, and we'll get to them at the end of our speakers' presentations. Now, last and certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ana-Maurine Lara. Dr. Ana-Maurine Lara is an assistant professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Oregon, as well as a national award-winning novelist and poet. Her work focuses on questions of Black and Indigenous people and freedom. She has been published in literary journals, academic journals, and numerous anthologies as a scholar and as a creative writer. She is the author of Ursuli's Skirt, When the Sun Once Again Sang to the People, Watermarks and Tree Rings, Cantos, Conjure Woman, and Sum of Parts. Her latest academic books include Street Walking, LGBTQ Lives and Protests in the Dominican Republic, published by Rutgers University Press, and Queer Freedom, Black Sovereignty, published by SUNY University Press. Her presentation is titled Queer Freedom, Black Sovereignty, and it is an exploration of Black queer ecologies of ontological freedom and spiritual sovereignty. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. I want to just start by saying that I am speaking to you from Kalapuya Ilihi, the forcefully ceded territories of the Kalapuya people. And I want to thank James Biles and Lara Rivas for inviting me to be here today. I also want to just say I'm honored to be on this panel with Sarah Riva and Dr. Doug Thomas. Particularly Dr. Thomas's work has been very significant to my own thinking and my own work. So it's really quite humbling to speak after you, Dr. Thomas. And it's wonderful. I'm so happy to be here today and to share some thoughts and some story with folks here. So let's start the slideshow. Okay. So again, as Lara stated, my talk is titled Queer Freedom, Black Sovereignty. And I invite us all to take a deep breath and to feel the fullness of that breath in our bodies. And to imagine the legacy of that breath, the air that's coming into our bodies, the air that's constituted by the water that rises from the land up into the sky and comes back down as rain. This talk is an ofrenda, a ceremonial offering that explores queer Black ecologies for sovereignty, as I have presented in my recent monograph, Queer Freedom, Black Sovereignty by SUNY Press. There are 4 vueltas or turns to this ofrenda, drawing from the traditional framework of the ceremonies of the 21 divisions. The first is an open inquiry into the problematics of the Caribbean context in which queer freedom, Black sovereignty are imagined. The second is the proposition of spiritual sovereignty as a site of analysis. The third is a story, and the fourth is a closing inquiry into what queer Black futures might require. I desire decolonization, as in I desire the full realization of our lives as queer peoples, as Black peoples, as Indigenous peoples. These decolonial desires are not metaphors, they are reoriented desires for the recuperation of body lands, water memories, and altars puntos through the continuous mobilization of the spiritual force of the people. By spiritual force, I am referencing queer Black genealogies born out of the collective stories of agency and marronage that are personal to my family, drawn from my peoples, and gathered from intellectual, artistic, and political precursors. I draw on what M. Jackie Alexander characterizes as the truth of spirit, in which the work of decolonization makes room for the deep yearning of wholeness, belonging that is both material and existential, both psychic and physical, and which, when satisfied, can subvert the ultimate and ultimately displace the pain of dismemberment produced by coloniality. By decolonization, I'm referring to a subject that is constituted by sacred connection, not just to other human beings, but to all that is life on this planet. I draw on Coley Driscoll's call for a sovereign erotics, a reconfiguration of how bodies are connected to and inscribed by nations, traditions, and histories in ways that require us to interrogate how our diverse genealogies are bound to land, memory, and history, but also specifically to the body. My desires are in conflict with the ontological possibilities delimited by Christian coloniality and its attendant capitalism, the imposition of the logics of conversion, accumulation, and ownership that has dispossessed and continues to dispossess millions of peoples, of body lands, of water memories, and alters puntos. Christian coloniality points to the violent and continual management of the most intimate levels of being, in which free movement is produced through this dispossession, settlement, and salvation, all theological ends to a violent means. As Sylvia Wynter and many others, including those here, have articulated to us, the hierarchies of humanness that emerged through Christian colonization have never functioned for the well-being of all, but rather for the accumulation of body, land, wealth, and spiritual intellectual authority for a few, manifest in institutions that have naturalized and continue to naturalize this order of things. Today, a prescient and ubiquitous manifestation of this system is the state. The state produces unique dilemmas in the realization of queer freedom and Black sovereignty. It produces temporal quandaries that are inherently exclusive. Whose time is more legitimate and central to life and personhood within the state? It produces spatial quandaries that go hand in hand with territorial quandaries. The Caribbean state produces additional dilemmas. Is the state in the Caribbean a neo-colonial state, post-colonial, a colonial settler state? Is it an imperial colonial state? And we know that this differs depending on the territory of which we speak. The Caribbean state is always already on the brink of being a failed state. The presence of a large number of Afro and Asian descendant peoples further complicates this dilemma. How do we reconcile the presence, power, and futurity of those who were brought against their own wills through processes of colonization and indentured servitude, and whose descendants now constitute the majority of the region's population? Here, the concept of the arrivant may prove useful. Drawn from Kamal Brathwaite's creative work, Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird articulates arrivants as those people forced into the Americas through the violence of European and Anglo-American colonialism and imperialism around the globe. The concept is rooted in a Black Caribbean poetics of being and place, gesturing to the multiple fundamentally unsettled and unsettling relations to place that manifest specifically in queer Black geographies. Arrivants are the majority in the Caribbean. In the wake of colonization, arrivants have created arrivant states throughout the Caribbean that are predicated on the perpetual negotiation of competing discourses and temporal spatial relationships to colonialism and to Western liberal notions of sovereignty. In these states, the exercise of sovereignty shifts between registers, encompassing the production of general norms by a body, the demos, made up of free and equal men and women, and the ability to exercise control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. As Yarimar Bonilla points out, states continue to act as agents. They legislate, they deport, they build, and they borrow. Even as governments are toppled, states themselves persist. Conceptualizing arrivant states allows us to think about the ways in which nation states in the Caribbean emerge from colonialism as contemporary polities that continue to enact Christian colonial visions of time and territorialized futures. Arrivant states perpetually negotiate the racial, gender, and sexual hierarchies that were produced through Christian coloniality, most often becoming the upkeepers and protectors of Christian colonial morality at the expense of queer Black people and our lives. Relatedly, arrivant states are predicated on the perpetuation of discourses and policies that undergird myths of Native Indigenous extinction, a problematic fallacy that applies to the condition of the state logics of racial, throughout the Americas. It's something that happens throughout the Americas and I think takes a particular shape in the Caribbean, the ways in which the indigenous peoples of any territory or land are always already presumed to have been extinct. All of these features taken together produce what could be construed as an arrivant state, which rather than functioning as a space of queer freedom, Black sovereignty, in its stead perpetuates unfathomable violence and death. Linked to these arrivant states are the various intellectual apparatus that sustain the state's spatio-temporalities and logics in place through discourse, policies, and historiography. The Dominican Republic is one such arrivant state in which the state discourses, policies, and practices perpetuate Catholic Hispanic temporalities, corporealities, and geographies to the detriment and continued decimation of queer Black peoples. It is in this context in which I theorize the contours and possibilities of queer Black ecologies, of ontological freedom and spiritual sovereignty, and articulate them as altars puntos, body lands, and water memories. Altars puntos is you. You are an altar punto. They are an altar punto. We are altars puntos. Discourses of mestizaje, so central to the project of eventual whitening of the arriving state, are the contradistinction to which an altar punto emerges. Within the framework of the arriving state's mestizaje, the primary ideological operatives are the logics of an undeniable multiplicity. So, for example, in the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico and Cuba, right, the common articulation that we are Spanish, Taino, and of African descent. This multiplicity and its attendant racial democracies, structure inequality, rooted in phenotypical traits that obscure the long history of Christian colonial politics of pureza de sangre, blood purity. The Dominican Republic, as an arriving state, takes the ideas present within discourses of mestizaje one step further. It roots itself in the superiority of Catholic Hispanidad, explaining away its color through the mythicized figure of the Indio, its queerness, Blackness, and the fictitious narrative of Haitian invasion, and explaining away both in the elevation of Spanish Christian ancestors above all others. To speak of altars puntos is to speak of rupturing these processes of genocide and blanqueamiento, or whitening. The woven density that emerges within Criollo spiritual traditions ruptures Christian colonial blood logics of racial hierarchy and gender binaries. By blood logics, I refer to the idea of mestizaje that fails to take grasp within spiritual ceremonial spaces because the presence of multiple, multi-located and differently geographically, historically, temporally, and socially located spirits and ancestors creates a context in which all are acknowledged and few can be negated, where the arriving state's temporal spatiality falls apart. To negate one's ancestors is to negate oneself as their descendant and caretaker. Even so, one's embodied social location and racialized subjectivity is also not negated. The body land is central to the manifestation of the altar punto's woven density. The concept of woven density here being that which allows us to visualize how gender, sexuality, and race are interconnected processes that draw on multiple registers and frameworks, and like spirit, shift according to context from one kind of humanness into other kinds of humanness. When the queerness of time condenses in the production of the Black body land, then gender is rearticulated along a different space-time access than that provided by Christian colonial teleology. When the Blackness of desire impulses the queer body land into life, then life is renewed through dance, prayer, sweat, sex, and contact between the immaterial and material worlds. In these moments, our body lands are at their densest possibilities and also at their freest. As Shiri Moraga reminds us, land remains the common ground for all radical action, but land is more than the rocks and trees, the animal and plant life that make up the territory. For immigrant and native alike, land is also the factories where we work, the water our children drink, and the housing project where we live. For women, lesbians, and gay men, land is that physical mass called our bodies. The concept of body land indexes the relationships and the simultaneous co-constructions of bodies and the lands across, through, on, and which those bodies exist. Body lands extend beyond mere flesh and soil into the subjectivities produced across changing body lands, whereby the histories, contradictions, absences produced by pillaging, captivity, severance, rape, torture, and development are rendered visible, even if at times illegible. Body lands bring into focus a gathering of social realities that are incommensurate with Occidental conceptualizations of the subject as body, sovereign and boundaried, and corporeal agency as an expression of that sovereign subject, the body. Rather than reproduce the same discourses of land as a subject object that is phenomenologically distinct from the body as subject object, we could conceptualize the two as mutually constituting subjects, where both act upon each other to inform the woven density of being. The logics of body land inform the framework of what could be construed as ecological and spiritual sovereignty that inform the spiritual and community leaders of multiple spaces, ceremonial communities, and that operate within three distinct registers of discourse. So in my ethnographic research, I encountered many different articulations of sovereignty, and these are three that that were counter to the ultranationalist articulations of sovereignty as nationalism, right? Sovereignty, the first is sovereignty is a mode of ecological interdependence in which local agricultural and mountain-based communities could defend their relationship to body lands, history, and ways of life. The second is sovereignty and its exercise as a mode of anti-imperialist resistance rooted in body lands in which solidarity with other campesinas, farmers, and laborers around the world transcends national identities. And the third is sovereignty as the rights of the poor against the impositions of wealthy elites, including wealthy landholders, foreign investors, the arrivant state government, and the local Catholic Church. In this last iteration, their fight against the continued deterritorialization of campesina families from communal body lands and water memories by church-sanctioned landowning elites really took form in a way that will be articulated in the story I'm about to share, and that I see as central to ecological integrity and campesino spiritual autonomy. So I will now tell you a story. And it starts with Nana Yvette, a Shishinde, a Mescalero Apache elder from the Texas-Mexico borderlands. She's holding her macaw feathers to the sky. She pulls the clouds down with them, the feathers sweeping toward the earth. She says, water carries all of the memory of our planet. That water, it may have started in an ocean, a river, a spring, but then it evaporates into the sky and it becomes the clouds and then it rains down onto the earth. It is part of a closed system. It has within it all of the memories of the planet. It is the same water that is inside of us. That is why when we pray to the water, we are praying for all of humanity too. We are in the community I will call Palo Blanco, a small rural community of 50 households in the mountains outside of Santo Domingo. Nana Yvette is standing inside a dried creek bed next to the almost dry spring. A small trickle of water has appeared under piled dry leaves that have fallen from the surrounding sapote trees. She clears the leaves from the spring and stands next to it. Nana Yvette is praying for the water to return to the spring, to the community where there is no water. 2 days a week, you can see a small truck carrying a large 300-gallon tank in its bed. It wanders along the dirt road, house to house, delivering water. When people have money, they purchase water for cooking and drinking. They use rainwater for their crops, for washing dishes and the floor. In 2008, young men from Palo Blanco and 2 neighboring communities collaborated to install pipes from a spring deep in the mountains. The spring provided water to over approximately 100 houses in all 3 communities. But in 2011, a recently anointed evangelical minister in the neighboring town, which I will call Chula Vista, made a unilateral decision to cut the pipeline off to Palo Blanco. The water, he decided, would only go to evangelical households, not to Catholic ones. Negotiations between the community leaders only further exacerbated the problem. The leaders in Palo Blanco are Catholic. The majority of the households in Palo Blanco are Catholic. Many also serve the misterios, what the evangelical ministers called demons, and which he in particular is attempting to eliminate from the body lands of the people. So there we are with Nana Yvette standing in a creek in Palo Blanco praying for water. She calls on the memory of the water, asks it to return to where it is needed. Space-time collapses and all that is water memory. If water memory is what sustains us, what makes our life, the life of all plants, animals, and living things possible, then it is our primary alternative to blood logics. That is the logics of blood purity and of contamination, the logics of enslavement or disappearance, the logics of animal husbandry and chattel breeding, the logics of bad blood and dirty wombs. Blood logics are scripted onto skin logics, rendering the body's color and its features as metaphors for blood. These metaphors are dangerous metaphors. They inform narratives of purity. They are used to deterritorialize people and kill them, to serve violence and the quest for power over all others, to claim mine different from yours, to draw lines between beings at the expense of all life. We are standing in a spring in Palo Blanco and we turn our heads to receive the rain. This is not an ofrenda that provides answers. Rather, like any ceremony, it calls on the audience to bear witness and to create. My decolonial desire impulses a woven density that is rhizomatic. It extends into multiple simultaneous directions established through relation. Drawing from woven density, I can embody, actualize, and move between what appear to be dimorphic forms, but which in actuality are polymorphic. and densely so. We are animate beings within a larger community of animate beings where difference is the norm rather than the exception. Uncertainty is part of our condition of existence, and the space of uncertainty could produce our greatest knowing. Our sovereign futures could rest on what we as of yet do not know, the call to the and both of possibilities. So in closing, I offer the following inquiries. What do queer Black people call forth with our presence? What stories bring queer Black people into being? What does the body land you stand on reveal to us about queer Black being? What is in our soil? What is the body land that does not carry capture, restraint, and genocide in its memory? What is that body land? Who is that body land? What could happen when we upend the logics of blood and in their place we enact the logics of water memory? What are we remembering when we walk through the world as queer Black people? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lara. And thank you, everyone. Once again, please go ahead and pose whatever questions you may have on the Q&A, and we'll be sure to address those. In the meantime, I can post a couple of questions that I have when considering the critique of liberal sovereignty in a more traditional, a more traditional take on the concept of sovereignty. And I'm thinking about the ideological weight of national liberation and anti-imperial movements and the currency that they hold in a post-colonial setting, and oftentimes for good reason, because imperial pursuits have surely marked the historical trajectory of Latin America and the Caribbean. However, we see, as you've exposed and as other decolonial and even historical materialist critiques illuminate the unrealized emancipatory ideals of independence and abolition as envisioned by liberal sovereignty and national liberation movements. The nation state has become a site for the reproduction of exclusionary narratives of belonging, implicating citizens as well as non-citizens. It is also a biopolitical mechanism for the reproduction of capitalist social relations. Increasingly, we are also seeing how crises of capital and the state and subsequent neoliberal configurations seem to be leading to a surge in conservative and ultranationalist groups associating sovereignty with nativist, anti-immigrant, and racist discourses in the post-colonial setting as well as beyond. And deepening through those dynamics, the disconnect between liberal sovereignty and emancipatory politics. So in light of such putative manifestations, it seems fitting to displace frameworks such as neocolonialism that advance the lack of sovereignty as the main problematic, and as such frameworks that at the very least seem compatible with more nationalism as a viable response. Can you offer some thoughts on this? Would you discredit neocolonialism as a useful lens? And if so, how can we begin to reconfigure the relation between anti-imperialism and spatial organization in the midst of ongoing global asymmetries? In other words, and perhaps more plainly, can we vindicate the state form in the quest for anti-colonial struggle? And if not, how can we deal with oppressive systems that transcend the nation state? And in some ways, I guess I'm trying to reconcile the fact that once national liberation is achieved, we continue to see the reproduction of the conditions against which people struggle and have struggled in a colonial as well as a post-colonial setting, while also recognizing the urgency of the political demand of self-determination within an imperial design and structures that we have currently in our political contemporary setting.
Maybe I'll start us off a little bit just by talking about I teach a seminar called Race, Nation, Empire, a graduate seminar called Race, Nation, Empire. And, you know, when we open the class, we talk about how, you know, the period of time during which the nation state has been the sort of taken for granted mode of organizing international relations is actually quite short in relation to the long, you know, history of humans inhabiting the planet. So I asked them to think about, you know, what it will look like, you know, a couple thousand years from now when people look back on this moment and they see this whole nation state thing as this weird blip, you know, like what were they doing? Why were they imagining that this was going to create, you know, more organized living or, you know, more efficient communication? You know, look at all the crazy things that happened during that period, you know, because we take for granted that that is how we are to organize our lives, when that hasn't always been the ways that we organize our lives, you know. And so I think it's really difficult to get people to think outside of the box of nationalist sovereignty. And therefore it's very vital to draw attention to these other manifestations of sovereignty that Ana-Maurine is talking about, or that others have written about, that don't hail the state. You know, because how can the state be the guarantor of your liberation when it is also always the site of violence, colonial settler violence, but also securitized violence?
I mean, my short answer is no. The state can never be the, you know, it's so, similarly, I have my students do thought exercises and practices around imagining different kinds of political associations that allow us to think through different kinds of human relations. You know, I think for me, it's a question of who you put at the center, right? If I'm putting queer Black people at the center, right? Queer, like queer colon Black, right? Where there's always this kind of analogical relationship that's taking place. If I put queer Black people at the center, the state is never going to sustain queer Black life, right? Like we know that the state by definition must excise the queer, the Black, you know, it must erase the indigenous, it must erase the people who are there, because it's, right, it's inscribing a completely different logic. And so, you know, but I think that it's a question too, that we in the contemporary moment imagine change and temporality on such a short measuring stick. If we are to reimagine our person as a person that extends 7 generations back and 7 generations forward, then even the way we think about the question changes. And so I'm interested in transforming the question. I'm interested in redirecting the gaze and actually finding the spaces where we are articulating other ways of being and other ways of relating and other ways of imagining ourselves. And that's why this, you know, this is a separate project from, an example, a project that looks at LGBTQ activists as people who are trying to enact political sovereignty through civil and human rights mechanisms, right? That's a different conversation.
Yeah, I thought your talks were beautiful, by the way. They both created like an affect, I don't know. And also, Deborah, yes, please explain to us the images that you used. I'm very interested. But yeah, I thought that they were like so beautiful to like show alternative forms of sovereignty, like not connected to the state directly. That I thought it was really, yeah, I really like them. Because in terms of, well, your question, even from my answer, which is, you know, sovereignty talking directly about this, you know, connected to the state, doesn't work because of neoliberalism, one of the reasons, right, is that everything is, not everything, but, you know, capital is one of the main things that states' interests are invested in. So if you are a state nation that, you know, Nauru, I was talking about Nauru, and Australia says, you want to hold some people who seek asylum? Here, there you go. This is the money. Build a prison and have them in. And they're like, okay, you know, because they need the money, they don't have the money, or no, it's not as like some countries say no, obviously, but there's like this power dynamic. So I guess it's complicated to, yeah, it has to be, we need to abolish borders and get rid of states.
Thank you for that. And maybe as a segue question, and looking at the failure of, I mean, if we want to look at the political intention, if it was ever that, but let's phrase it that way, the political intention of sovereignty as a corrective to colonial violence, for instance, and recognizing its failure to achieve this, giving our current ways of organizing politically, well, the hegemonic ones at least, you know, of organizing politically, socially, and economically. What are some of the strategies, and maybe you've already touched on these in your talk, but maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more on the strategies and analytical openings that you've come to regard as valuable or insightful for avoiding in the same fashion the re-systematization of colonial structures of power along the way. I thought that maybe Dr. Riva, you could address this in relation to the political project of border abolition, and maybe Dr. Lara and Dr. Thomas, in whichever way you want, but it occurs to me your emphasis on witnessing, or your concept of witnessing or weaving densities as an ongoing practice, and how it might help us from fetishizing or essentializing well-defined political projects and identities at the expense of liberatory ends. Also, if I can add to, please feel free to also address yourselves. I feel like I jumped into the questions and it might seem a bit more structured than we'd like it to be. So please feel free to address one another as well if you'd like to.
I'll jump in. So I think border abolition is just, I mean, obviously it's not the solution to everything. I'm only addressing like one oppression. I mean, I think it's super important to abolish borders, but I think there's, you know, racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, you know, all these oppressions that are like, you know, colonial continuation, you know, they're just, like it wouldn't change everything. So I really don't have an answer to that, unfortunately. I wish it was, well, I don't know, if border abolition solved everything. I mean, it's pretty hard to achieve anyway, but you know, it would be fantastic, but I'm afraid it's not as simple. But yes, Deborah, and when you talk, can you tell us about the images, please, that you showed?
Yeah, okay. So, you know, I find that in my sort of artistic practice, but also in my anthropological practice, that I have been a kind of assembler and creator of archives, right? So we, you know, many scholars have talked a lot about the violence of the archive, right? And especially the violence of the colonial archive, in which we don't typically see ourselves except as, you know, a problem, you know, either a complainant in a court case, or, you know, one doesn't appear in a colonial archive unless you're sold or dead or some other kind of way going against the legal and juridical arrangement of the state. So I find that often one must create one's own archives, and sometimes those are narrative, archives of narratives. Sometimes there are images, sometimes there are snippets of performance or other kinds of material culture. And in thinking about how to assemble those archives and to place them in juxtaposition with each other, one is attempting to open a conversation, or I am anyway, and I with my collaborators, we're attempting to open a certain kind of conversation in which these archives are viewed and understood differently from how they normally would be. So what you were seeing was some of the archives that we assembled for this project called Tivoli Stories that has taken a variety of forms. One is a kind of 40-minute documentary. What you saw was the sort of non-linear, non-narrative experimental short. There is sound, I just didn't play it, and it's actually brilliant sound, composed by and arranged by Junior Wedderburn. But also a museum installation. And we do different things with these things because they're supposed to be addressing particular audiences. And in that short bit that you saw, we, I think, very clearly see from very different vantage points, including drone footage from the US, as there was a security overhead during the operation. The ways, the entanglements of the Jamaican state, the US kind of imperial state enact, and the military and the police in Jamaica enact particular forms of state violence. But you also see, I think, in that shorter piece, these archival moments of life and the kinds of life archives that people practice and enact and engage in different kinds of ways at different times. And some of them are forms of spiritual sovereignty, as Ana-Maurine was talking about. You saw sort of snippets from a revival sort of church service. But some of them are popular, popular street dance. And, there's not always a lot of difference between that sacred form and that secular form. And that, of course, in itself is a way of enacting life in various spheres. So, I think these modes of sovereignty are enacted all the time at different levels of scale, not the state level, right? At both levels that exceed that scale of the state and more grassroots levels sort of that evade that level of the state. And it's just to recognize them as modes of sovereignty, sovereign practice, sovereign performance, sovereign feeling, a sovereign engagement with one's own body, one's own cultural forms, one's own practices that connect one to the generations before, the generations to come, again, as Ana-Maurine was saying. So I think it just, like, imagining sovereignty in a different register just in many ways means paying attention to what is happening, on the ground and transnationally, the ways that people are building worlds for themselves that evade the state in one way or another. And I'll leave that there. And I'll also say that I'm really sorry, but in a couple minutes I'm going to have to sign off because I'm hosting a book party for someone, so I'm going to have to go to that. But anyway, I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Before you go, Dr. Thomas, I just wanted to say, watching those images, my heart was palpitating so quickly because of the level of familiarity of the images at every register, right? So it could have been Jamaica, it could have been Dominican Republic, it could have been Haiti, it could have been Miami, and so there, I'm still sitting with what that means to have these images that felt so familiar, and yet I was supposed to not know them because I've never actually been to Jamaica. So I'm supposed to not know them, right? But I knew them, and I think that the idea of what is the story that goes with them, what is the way in which we experience each other through these non-narrative images that reveal so many other stories, is such a powerful archive of imagination. And I wanted to thank you for that. It was really beautiful. And I mean, I had questions too, but I don't think we have much time. So I'm just going to say that I saw one question is about what is the significance of engaging spirituality? And for me, the colonialism was a war on the spirit, right? And it continues to be a war on the spirit. And if we operate within the logics of Christianity, we see the spirit as separate from the body and as separate from relationship. And if we don't, if we refuse that category of spirituality, if we refuse that definition of spirituality and articulation of spirituality, then we start to see and understand that what we're talking about is about a war of preservation against the forces that seek to continuously ontologically destroy queer Black life.
Thank you, Dr. Lara. I see that there's a question addressing unhinged sovereignty, but unfortunately, I don't know if you have time to get to it, Dr. Thomas. I know you have to get off, and if so, thank you so much for joining us today. But otherwise, I can't hear you, but I think you're saying you have to go. Okay, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for participating today. We have another couple of questions here, Dr. Riva, that you could probably speak to. They're addressed to you. One of them is, could you explain a bit more how bordering mechanisms create a distance between the state and the asylum seeker? And there's also, okay, go ahead. There's another one.
I'm reading the other. The first one is, do you remember the story I told about the Moroccan woman who tried to reach France and she didn't get the visa? So that's one of the ways in which the state is setting this distance. But also, when the state confines people in detention centers that are privatized, what happens is that they disavow their responsibilities. If something happens to one of the detainees, which happens all the time, like they die, they have accidents, they get injured, they get sick and they don't get medical attention, or they get it late and not in time, what the situation is the following. Since the state hired the CCA, or well, there's two big prison companies in the US, but everywhere, they're not in the US, they're transnational, they're everywhere. What happens is that this US state says, there's a company in charge of this, and the company says, I was hired by the US, this is not my responsibility. And what happens is that the person dies and nobody cares. I mean, nobody's responsible for that. And you read about these cases all the time about people who are trying to cross a border, and then when they send them back a body in a box. I mean, and I don't know, it's one of the things that is so outrageous. It's one of the things that, Audre Lorde talks about anger, how important anger is. That's one of the things that makes me, I just don't know how people sleep at night, knowing that this is happening with their taxes, with their, but it happens everywhere. It happens in Europe, it happens in Australia, it happens in the US, it happens everywhere. So the state is like, this is not my responsibility, which is totally is. And the second question, which is connected to that question, is like, why do states lock up asylum seekers when seeking asylum, which is not illegal? Well, I didn't read the whole question, sorry. Also, when happens, exactly. So that's actually the question. When mismanagement of people happens in this, the question is gone. Anyway, it happened. Okay, here it is. It happens. Who is to take the blame? Nobody takes the blame. This is the thing. Sometimes they close the prison. Sometimes no. It's happened like once in history. And then they build a new prison, or it's the same one with another name. And then you go to LinkedIn, because you don't need really big detective skills either, And then you see that the CEOs are the same people. They just change the name of the company and nothing happens. Because capital is the one who's directing the whole operation. The UN, and then going to, sorry, I'm talking really fast because we don't have a lot of time, but UNHCR says that countries should not look up asylums, people who seek asylum. It should be like the last thing to do. And yet this is like a common practice, that countries that have signed the 1951 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol keep locking people who seek asylum, in prisons. So why do they do it? They say it's a deterrence mechanism. Okay, so imagine you're running from your country because probably, and actually the country you're running to is probably responsible for the violence in your country, but let's just, and then they lock you up indefinitely in a private prison. So they're making profit. So it's not enough to exploit you when you're in your country, making t-shirts or whatever. But if you try to run away to another country, they're also going to exploit you and dress you. This is something that I have to tell you. When I was doing my research in the detention center, I was talking to a woman, I think from Honduras. And I was like, she was locked up. And when you get locked up, they give you like a t-shirt, a pair of pants, shoes. And I was saying, so what did you do in your country back there? And she goes, I made this t-shirt. This is where I used to work. And I was like, so this is like an endless cycle of exploitation, endless, it's not enough to exploit women when they're there, but we have to exploit them when, so they lock them up. They say it's deterrence. Officially, they lock them up to check that their identities, that they're not criminals, but you don't need to lock someone for 7 years to check that they're not a criminal. And also in the US, there's statistics that show that people who cross the border and they just get a notice to appear, which is just like a paper, I'm going to this state. Okay, this is your court in this place, Cleveland or wherever, right? Ohio, this is 90% of the people show up in the court hearing. So it's not like, people want to live their lives, in the border for the whole life. No, people want to just be like everybody else, so yeah. So that's yeah.
Sara, I was really struck by your presentation. Like a lot of it is, I know because of experiences of people in my life, right? Going through detention or deportation. And some of it I didn't know, but when you actually say that the external, the boarding practices are everywhere, what strikes me about that was seeing the map where, Australia and Europe, the European Union are establishing these systems of, that in and of itself undermines national sovereignty, right? And at the same time, like you said, replicates these colonialist narratives and discourses and practices. But I was just struck by the ways in which, in the United States specifically, we have entire discourses about abolitionist practices regarding the imprisoned, right? People who go through the prison system, which is a space of exception in terms of labor, right? And the kind of exercise of labor. But the space of exception, the camp of exception, right? Like in the detention centers, it's not a space, are people put to work in the same way that they're put to work in prisons? Or is the function of their bodies in that space to be non-working, to therefore to therefore occupy the space of non-being? It's, and also thinking about just how that connects to the everywhere that you were speaking of, right? The ubiquity of these colonial imperial reaches. No.
Yeah, this is especially bad in the Anglosphere. So the Anglosphere, so the UK, the US, Australia, they all have privatized prisons. It doesn't, like Spain, for example, they're public. They're not even prisons, like these detention centers, but they're public. Absolutely. So first of all, transnational sovereignty, that's what they're exercising. They're exercising sovereignty beyond the physical territory. And that's why they're everywhere. You have Australia guarding Afghanistan's border because they know that if people start fleeing, it's to Australia where they're going to go. So it's like, we need to control the border over there. No, it's absolutely terrible. And in regard to what do they do in detention centers? No, there's limited, very limited opportunities to work. So there's nothing to do there. But it's true that where I was with in a family, which is not family, just mothers and underage kids, a detention center. So they were mostly taking care of their kids, the mothers, you know. But no, they profit of these women by dressing them, feeding them, you know, just having their bodies there. And it's a like crazy system because they move them around. And Nancy Hiemstra has written about this. It's completely arbitrary. You don't know why they're moving people from one place to the next. Why suddenly you're out? And obviously you need to pay to live. You need to pay a bond or live with an ankle monitor, which talks to surveillance, our society and surveillance and all this. So yeah, you need to pay a really expensive bail if you want to live anyway. So, and who makes the ankle monitors? Who's profiting of that? You know, and also, yeah, and also
Jeff Bezos from Amazon.
Absolutely. So it's like this money-making machine. And I was even thinking, do you really make that much money out of prisons? Is it such a good business? You know, but it's not only prisons. They usually have like security companies, like other things, you know, there's like these big machines with all these things going on. Yeah, I don't know. And I remember when Trump got elected, that the first day the stock exchange market for those like like for the geo company and the prisons dropped, and I was like, what? And then the next day, like 2 days later, it went right back up, obviously, right, what we were expecting. So I'm like, just obviously abolish them, but at least don't make them private, because there's an incentive to make money. So obviously they're going to be locking people, you know, and nobody wants to stop this machine.
Thank you, Sarah, Dr. Liva, and thank you, Ana-Maurine, Lara, once again for joining us. We are out of time, and Professor Balz, I'm going to turn it back to you in just a minute, but I just want to at the very least acknowledge a question that we left unanswered and read the last bit of it so that we can take it with us and reflect on it in the spirit of what this session was supposed to be about, even though we don't have time to discuss it. As you unhinge sovereignty from the state and reframe and maybe rescale it so that we might ask what sovereignty feels like, one is likely to encourage many valences that reflect varied social relations and politics of place. As these talks have suggested in different ways, sovereignty also articulates itself as ordering processes, transnational, affective, and relational. So the question is, and it's a beautiful one at that, how do these approaches and reframing sovereignty can help us fight for something beyond imagining, given the current organization of the world in which we imagine, struggle, and seek to redefine? Thank you once again for joining us. And Professor Balz, I turn it back to you because I believe you have some announcements.
Yeah, well, just very briefly, and all I can do is echo Laura's gratitude and thank Doctors Lara, Riva, and Thomas for joining us. And thank you especially, Laura, for organizing the session. I want to leave us with the reminder that Live CLAG will continue again next week. I'm sharing my screen here. So our session next week focuses on decolonizing knowledge production and dissemination in Latin America. The session will be moderated by the editor of the Journal of Latin American Geography. It's next Thursday, April 1st. It's not April Fool's Day, 4 p.m. So I hope to see you there. Once again, thank you to our panelists and to Laura, and we'll see you next time on Live CLAG. Good night, everybody. Take care.